afternoon to you. Why does it seem that the military in Burkina Faso has had a coup now? What's driving this at this particular time?
Thank you, Stephen. Good afternoon. Yes, it seems it's a very interesting sort of convergence of events, and I think the immediate trigger point was that in the initial list of demands that the mutineers have indicated is that they want more allocation of resources in their fight against jihadists, but they're also asking for resignation of army chiefs. That's the immediate demands. But if you take a long-term or bird's eye view of the causes, I think it boils down to issues about just the worsening security situation, particularly in the northern and eastern parts of Burkina Faso, where we've seen an uptick in violent incidents and in attacks by jihadist militants. We've also seen an increasing issue where the economy has been facing serious challenges. Levels of poverty have been increasing, and there's also been take into account also that there's been widening public discontent with the international intervention against jihadists. They're saying that it seems not to be accomplishing its objectives. So all these factors are sort of built up to this moment where the army has decided to take matters into its own hands.
If the army decides to take matters into its own hands, I mean, that's obviously undemocratic. But is it actually going to help Burkina Faso fight the insurgency? Would it make the fight against the insurgency any better?
I think at this point, let's take a step back and look at the broader political history of Burkina Faso. We saw President Blaise Compaoré being ousted in 2014, and the promise of reforms, piecemeal as they might have turned out to be, in this idea of reducing just the kind of the hand of the military in political affairs. But this sort of attempt at the Faustian bargain that was centered around political reform seems to have got a tug of war, particularly between civilian elites and the military. So this continuing hand of the military looking for a way perhaps of re-establishing its age-old control over political affairs. I mean, this is now the 9th coup in Burkina Faso's history. And when you look also at the wider regional picture, it seems that there's a particular reading of the environment and a trend towards coups. And particularly importantly here is when you look at the situation in Burkina Faso, it mirrors that of Mali, and it's a situation where there's been discontent about the fighting against jihadists. You have a government that is losing traction, it's losing public confidence, and you have also worsening economic situation not helped by the pandemic, obviously. So all these factors are mirrored in a wide scale, and obviously there are nuances with the Burkina Faso situation, but it's interesting because there seems to be that regional dynamic where governance deficits are not being addressed, and the military or bullets are being seen as more preferable than to the ballot, for instance.
So, I mean, you talk about this insurgency. I know Western media calls it an Islamist insurgency. Is that playing a major role in places like Guinea and Mali, where there have also been coups recently? I mean, are all of these coups happening because of the insurgency?
They're happening largely because I would say the main structural drivers as your socioeconomic conditions, your governance deficits. That's the main driver. The issue of the insurgency or the violence by jihadists is just one more compounding, one more driver that sort of feeds into the bigger pool of turmoil that we are having. And the issue that when these two factors combine, so you have challenges at the security level, you have challenges at a developmental level, and you have challenges at a democratic level. So that confluence of factors, I think, is what has led. The trigger might have been the issue of the violence and the worsening public safety security situation, and also state-sponsored violence by civilians. But this cannot be detached from the broader governance and economic picture, obviously, Stephen.
So, I mean, growing an economy, we know, is very, very difficult to do. So I suppose we could imagine our youth unemployment rate, add an insurgency on top of that, which we don't have, people bombing shopping centres and schools, and you realize how difficult this is. Why is this insurgency so difficult to stop? There's a big French force there that was supposed to try and stop the insurgency. Why has it been so difficult?
one major issue has been, particularly when you look at the jihadist militants. I prefer to call them jihadist militants rather than insurgents per se, just because of the kind of the socio-political nature of their emergence and their radicalization strategies. So the jihadists particularly have had very adaptive strategies in fighting the international coalition of forces there. In fact, when you look at in the past 3 years, you see them banding together, forming this larger coalition that is almost cutting across the countries of the Sahel. So Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, you see jihadists joining up, particularly when you look at Mali, which has been the epicenter for a while. You have the JNIM, which is now this larger coalition of jihadist forces, combining strategies and combining firepower to actually target government and coalition forces. But also interesting, the coalitional forces have found themselves on the backhand in that regard. They've also found themselves facing backlash from civilians because of the kind of violence that they've enacted on civilians. So this idea of indiscriminate force being used against civilians has not worked also in their favor, and that is why there has been that sentiment, negative sentiment about the international coalition forces. So when you look at this combination of issues, also not forgetting a very weak state presence, particularly in the borderlands of the Sahel. So all this ungoverned, unmanned spaces where there's very little presence of state security forces has also allowed the jihadists to sort of adapt their strategies and also widen their territorial control over these issues, extending obviously into the borders, as I explained.
I mean, there's a real risk of a sort of downward spiral here. So you have the insurgency, you have a very slowly moving economy. Then what happens is there's people grow frustrated with democracy. There's a coup. The military takes over. What happens after that? I mean, there's a risk that this whole area goes from being largely democratic to being completely undemocratic.
There's that risk particularly, but it's like I said, it's been fed by the broader context that we are seeing. But also interestingly, when you look at the political history, that's just the issue of the number of coups that have happened in the past. It seems then the mutineers or the juntas that have taken place. I mean, this is the fourth coup in the span of 18 months that we've had in the region. And they seem to be reading from a particular playbook. So it's this idea of you take over power, then you seem to create some sort of transitional arrangement, and you throw around a few appeasement terms, stock terms like your civilian-led transitional arrangements. And of course, when the time comes, you almost use it as a bargaining chip, like what we've seen in Mali, happening with them deciding to renege on their initial statement and saying, no, we're going to extend the transitional period by another 4 years. That seems not to have resonated in Ouagadougou. They read the moment, they saw it as an opportune time to actually launch their coup at this point. And that's just the broader regional context. There's certain factors that seem to be converging and allowing these trends of coup to particularly take hold in the region.
Faith Mabera, thank you very much indeed from the Institute for Global Dialogue. Really do appreciate the time, a senior researcher there. Incredible situation developing in West Africa.